Good afternoon and welcome back to CEDA's State of the Nation panel session on the circular economy and the reforms and policies that we need to drive towards that circular economy. Now, a lot of the State of the Nation discussion so far is really focused on how we think differently, how we challenge ourselves and how we become more dynamic. And I can't think of an issue that epitomises the kind of change in mindset that we need more than moving from a linear to a circular economy. And it requires us to challenge, some basic things that are happening in our economy at the present time, like the production of 74 million tonnes of waste each year, or the fact that globally we see, 90% of raw materials don't find their way back into the economy. If we do challenge these things, there's some really big potential dividends. And PwC has done some work estimating this, looking at $1.8 trillion of direct economic benefits in the next 20 years, and also abating quite a large amount of carbon in the process as well. So we're going to have a bit of a chat about how we might start to capture and harness these benefits and move more towards a circular economy. And we've got a fantastic panel with all different perspectives on how we achieve this. We've got Jane Coram, Director of the Land and Water Business Unit at the CSIRO, joining us. We've got Richard Kirkman, who's the Managing Director and CEO of Veolia, Australia and New Zealand. And we also have Ashleigh Morris, who's the CEO and co-founder of Coreo. Now, as per usual, we do have the capacity for audience questions through the app, if you've got that, or through Pigeonhole, ceda.pigeonhole.at, and you can use the code SON2021 to go in and ask your questions. Please jump in and do that sooner rather than later. Get those questions in. If you do it sooner, you'll maximise the number of votes that you get from other audience members around your question. We are going to have about 20 minutes of discussion here with the panel, and then we'll move to the question and answers from the audience. So I want to start with you, Jane. CSIRO has obviously done a lot of thinking in this area, including publishing a national roadmap on the circular economy. When we look at that, what are some of the key kind of steps and ingredients that we need to really make this happen in Australia? And I guess more broadly as well, do you think we're all on the same page in terms of what actually constitutes a circular economy and the benefits of that?
Thank you very much. And by way of context, we've got a lot of motivation and willingness to realise a circular economy, but as you've highlighted, the steps that we take to realise it and even the common understanding of what circular economy looks like is very variable. So CSIRO was recently commissioned by the Federal Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources to undertake, to develop a national roadmap for realising the government's objectives of reducing waste to landfill by 80% by 2030 and in response to the ban of waste plastics, paper, glass and tyres. The roadmap aimed to explore the technical opportunities and enablers of a circular economy for those materials, which have now been banned for export. And it was a very consultative exercise which engaged with more than 80 government research and business participants to explore the viability of technical solutions in the Australian context and to identify levers and barriers for the implementation of circular economy. What the roadmap did find to the circular economy strategy that can both address fundamental environmental issues and also foster economic development and employment, and in the process potentially more than tripling jobs in resource recovery and increasing Australia's recovery rate would lead to great increases in GDP. In fact, an increase of just 5% would add an estimated $1 billion to the GDP. But as we all know, realising a circular economy is very complex, and the roadmap identified 6 key elements of a circular economy for those 4 materials, for plastics, glass, paper and tyres. The first one focuses around retaining material through use and collection, recognising that materials that are kept in circulation are valuable many times over, and the less processing they need, the more valuable they are. So product cycle must allow for easy disassembly, collection and sorting infrastructure to retain as much high quality material as possible. Secondly, we need to upscale and innovate recycling technologies through collaboration between government, research and industry, both in terms of improved planning for reverse logistics and state-of-the-art recycling technology that's designed in collaboration with research, industry and commerce. The third element was innovating and collaborating in design and manufacture. So in some existing product streams, especially glass, recycled material can be readily substituted for virgin material. But our big opportunity is innovation, and again, between government, science and industry, for incorporating secondary materials in product design and business models. Fourthly, we need to develop markets for secondary materials and the products that need them. So high quality secondary material is little value if there's no market for it, and additional efforts needed both to develop those markets but also connect the supply with the markets. So that can be supported by three initiatives. Firstly, product standards that allow the use of secondary materials wherever possible. Government agencies and sustainable organisations can seize the opportunity and implement procurement practices to prioritise recycled materials, particularly in construction, and also financial incentives to encourage the use of recycled products. The two final elements are equally important to those initial ones, which sort of focus around innovation. The process and the challenge of streamlining nationally consistent governance is a big one across different levels of government, but we badly need nationally consistent standards for material use and collection so that recycling can reach economies of scale. And we need uniform rules and mechanisms across jurisdictions to reduce the cost of recycling and increase levels of compliance. And finally, but certainly not least, we really need to focus on building a national zero waste culture. So where everyone thinks reuse before they throw out, where there's clear and consistent product labelling and recycling instructions, where there's coordinated government, industry and local initiatives, and also national campaigns around education and building confidence in circular economy, and metrics and targets for assessing how we're performing, recognising the importance of using data and decision making as per previous talks. Good question around whether we're all on the same page in relation to what constitutes a circular economy. I think we're all at a general, this is a good thing sort of level, but circular economy certainly means different things to different people. Of the more than 80 participants who were involved in developing the roadmap, all saw enormous value in managing a transition to circular economy, but also saw that the lack of manufacturing capability that could benefit from secondary materials was a key impediment to achieving circularity. And whilst most people tend to focus on the need to rethink current supply chains and to engage in circularity in planning and design, most of our lived practice in Australia focuses on recycling and resource recovery. And there's also a long way to go in terms of connecting up the innovation and research and development with large-scale commercialisation. And finally, realising a circular economy is going to look different at different phases. So in the short term, it's going to look very much like confronting with the current levels of waste and waste stockpiles and realise the benefits from them. But in the longer term, in the medium term, we want to use innovation to create novel products and materials and engage in redesigning products so that we can have circularity from the very beginning, the get-go. And finally, we want to move to planning for closed-loop industrial and urban systems where we're reusing large amounts of materials that are embodied in transport and major infrastructure is fundamentally focused on achieving a circular economy. At each step, the benefits of achieving a circularity are likely to grow by an order of magnitude, but also environmental and social co-benefits will also increase significantly. So I think it's different things to different people at different times, and that's where we really need a unifying vision that's reflected in all levels of government decision-making to pull all those pieces together.
Well, thanks for that, Jane. I think that's a really great overview of a lot of the issues, and want to come to Ashleigh and then Richard on kind of how this is playing out in communities and in the economy. Ashleigh, you're obviously working with Lend-Lease in Yarrabilba in southeast Queensland. I'm very proud of myself being able to pronounce that as someone who comes from Queensland, and working on the first circular economy community. How is that kind of national roadmap translating at the community level, and what are the sort of things that you're doing when you're working with communities on this to make sure that everyone is on the same page, and that it's a really a realistic and achievable aspiration that everyone can get behind?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. And I think Jane laid a good foundation for this as well at a community scale. So to set the scene a little bit for people who aren't familiar with Yarrabilba, and good pronunciation, Jared, Yarrabilba is a master plan community that Lend-Lease is developing about 40 minutes southwest of Brisbane. It's a greenfield community, so we are designing this from scratch. It has a 32-year development timeline, so that speaks to a lot of the unknowns for us about different technology that will come into play that we can't even envisage today. It will be home to 50,000 people and have 11 schools, just to give you a sense of the size of this particular community. So in 2019, we developed Australia's first circular economy strategy for this master plan community. And it was very aptly titled More Than Waste, because we very much need to move the narrative on a circular economy to that higher level, but recognising we do have a challenge around legacy waste materials. So the strategy for us really takes a systemic approach to community development. We recognise that there's a lot of interconnectedness and interdependencies of utility flows, so water and energy, as well as the materials that circulate through these communities, and also with the interaction with the actual residents that live in Yarrabilba. So accordingly, the strategy covers agriculture, water, waste, energy, technology, transport, and community. So it's very systems-led, and we're designing on that system and its different contexts. Now, the residents in Yarrabilba, that call this place home, their value is aligned to the circular economy. They're a very, opportunistic and optimistic set of residents. And really the narrative on a linear economy being very extractive and depleting of people's values is certainly no longer viable or tenable for the people that live here. I would say if you walk to someone in Yarrabilba, walk up to them and ask, do you know what a circular economy is? And can you list the 3 principles that underpin it? They won't be able to tell you that, but they'll be able to point to initiatives that have been done in the community that relate to circular economy. Some of those that they may have participated in, because Lend-Lease has been very active in promoting it, engaging with the community, but through a tangible approach, so people can actually get a sense of how it benefits them directly and their families, and the benefit it has to the wider community, whether that's reduction in their consumption of energy, in usage of water, reduction in the generation of waste, but also the capturing of those types of materials to benefit the soils, to grow produce that they sell then in the local cafes. These are all smaller scale examples that are being done, but speak to that macro narrative about what we need to see more broadly when we're talking about the circular economy. We need to really design our communities with circularity at its heart. And we are here with Lend-Lease, and they've been really visionary in their leadership in regards to the circular economy.
Well, I think it's a really important point that you make, Ashleigh, around, residents wanting to see tangible or their understanding of this very much being about tangible projects or things that they've experienced. Richard, I think this leads us into, obviously business has got a big part to play here. And when you're sitting in the seat that you have in Australia and New Zealand and looking at the opportunities that are out there in this space, but also as you look at investments and sort of some of the make or break factors that drive investments in a circular economy, what's the thinking like? And perhaps, how does the thinking differ from any other project that a company like yours undertakes?
So the context for Veolia, just to put it from where we're coming from, we're a water, waste and energy business. So everything we do is around providing clean water, recycling water, providing renewable energy, or in some way trying to recover from the waste streams. This is very central to what we do. Our overall purpose is ecological transformation, which includes other things around the environment, such as remediating land, capturing carbon emissions, providing clean water to communities. But nestled within that is this concept of circular economy. And, I think historically, a lot of people have thought circular economy just means recycling, but it certainly does, as Ashleigh pointed out, also mean energy and water. And those two things are critical to it, because you may recycle some material, but cause a higher impact on energy or water. So you don't want to go down that route. So for us, it's really about, can we find viable, scalable models for implementing the circular economy? So a good example of something that's been successful for many years is paper recycling. 70% of fiber products that are put onto the market are recovered, and that's a good starting place compared to plastics, which are around 8% globally, which is a really not a good place to be in terms of making those products circular. So we can easily see, when we look at investments, what is working today at scale and what isn't. And where there are projects that are working at scale, we're ready to invest in them. And where there aren't, our role is to really push regulators and policymakers to come up with the right policies and incentives that back up those policies to allow things to happen. So I would broadly separate our investments into two areas: post-consumer and pre-consumer. So in the post-consumer world, so waste that are arising at doorsteps and from households, it's very difficult to recycle a lot of those materials and to get the best from a circular economy, because the jobs already happen somewhere else and the incentives aren't yet in place to make that happen. So I would say in Australia, the policies are coming out now that will back that around materials. The incentives are not yet in place for the business case to work, but at least the policy has flagged that it needs to happen. So that's a good place to start. At the moment, there's at least 20 million tonnes of waste, residual waste, that just goes to landfill, and there's no way to recover that. And the landfill levies that exist are just providing supplements to tax. And I think the desire to move away from that model is difficult, because now it's a source of income. A lot needs to happen in that space, I would say, for more recovery to happen. From your recycling bin at home, 50% is not recyclable that's in the recycling bin, and we need to do something about that. On the industrial side, the pre-consumer, I think I'm much more optimistic, and the impacts are much higher there, and people don't see that as often unless you're in a particular industry. You don't really see how things are manufactured. But there, I think there are business models that work today, and the examples would be, I can give an example like a brewery where they're just taking water from the local creek. They're using hops to make a product, and then they would put the water back into the creek post-use, and then the solid waste would go to landfill. We've implemented projects where we use those solid waste to produce biogas. We use that biogas to treat the water. They recycle all the water. They use all their own energy. It's the real circular economization of industry. And that's at a scale that we really do need to adopt more widely. And I think it's probably just inertia and investment cycles that mean that it's not rolling out quick enough. And that's really something that my company is looking at investing in across Australia. So Australia can continue to use its natural resources and manufacture and, feed consumerism, which I think is impossible to stop, but at the same time make it sustainable.
Richard, I want to stay with you for a minute, because you've mentioned the issue around incentives. There was an OECD study in 2019 that really reflected on a number of the impediments to having a circular economy on the kind of government policy side, whether that was a lack of a clear vision, or not measuring performance, or not having sort of implementable initiatives on this. What are the sorts of things that you would want to see at different levels of government in Australia to promote a circular economy, and perhaps be the kind of marginal impact on some of those investments that you would be looking at in this area?
Yeah, well, look, I think, packaging is a good place to start because it's very visual and it's a place where not much action has happened so far. And I think if you can solve packaging, you can transfer that model to electronic equipment, to furniture, to textiles, and to all the other streams. Because packaging is particularly challenging because it's so different and there's so many different combinations of it. I think there's 5 policy instruments, incentives that can be put in place that can solve packaging. One is a common collection method. So if you always collect in the same way everywhere, then people know how to do it and they can do it much more easily. You make it easy for people. Labeling is the second part of that, because whilst people can learn pretty quickly where to put their recyclables and organic waste, if it's not labeled as to whether it's biodegradable or what type of plastic it is, or whether it's paper and plastic combined, then people don't know where to put it. And labeling is not very advanced across Australia at the moment. I think the third one is really resetting industry's incentive around using recycled content. I don't see much labeling around recycled content. I don't think I could go and see a whole supermarket shelf that had recycled content of the packaging. It's very niche, and niche is not good if you want to really make this happen across the economy. The fourth one is around collection systems, collection deposit systems. And I think Australia is actually ahead of most other places in that respect. They have really good deposit schemes and they're growing. So that's a good big tick. And then I guess the most controversial one would be around producer responsibility and how to make that work. I think product stewardship is good because it makes people act quickly. But at the end of the day, voluntary schemes are not going to solve the problem at scale. And I really believe that you have to put the problem in the hands of the people that make things, because when a product ends up in a bin and the local authority has to pay for it to be collected, they can't impact how that was made in the first place. But if you put the costs of that disposal with the manufacturer, they can, and they will reduce the cost and make it more recyclable. And it's not actually a higher overall cost to society to pay as you buy. And if you think about when you buy products today, you pay for the labor, the resources, the materials, everything that's gone into making that product, except you don't pay for how it's thrown away. Why wouldn't you? That just doesn't make sense. And if you did pay for that, someone's got to pay for it at some point. So we're not talking about increasing the costs, we're talking about shifting it to a place where someone can take action. And I think that fundamental shift would have a huge impact.
Okay, there's some specifics in that. Thank you, Richard. And interesting, just that the last part of that, just the obviously seeing in the climate area when you talk about Scope 3 emissions, seeing some similar kind of debates there. We do have some questions coming in on the portal, which is fantastic. Keep them coming. I want to come to you, Ashleigh, on this as well. I mean, obviously, as part of your work, you're working with various levels of government. Are there things that you would like to see each of those levels of government doing more of in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need stronger leadership at all levels of government, but I also think it needs to be bipartisan leadership because we need a systems-led approach to circular economy. And I think what we have right now in Australia is a lack of leadership and a lack of systemic action. And overarching all of this, because it's an economic narrative that we're really talking about, which has a lot of material, focuses in it, but we need to put forward a value proposition to the global economy. We are a resource-rich nation. What is our, value proposition into that global narrative, into a global economy? Now, I think the opportunities far outweigh the risks, but the risks are very great for our global economy. And if we don't have a strong narrative, we might see Australia decoupled from other economies around the world and fundamentally be left out of the loop. If we stay in this very linear and extractive thinking and model of material use and wastage. Now, in Australia, at all levels of government, our efforts on the circular economy have so far centred around waste management because we do have legacy issues. But to be honest, I think this is a bit of a wasted opportunity. There's so much more we could do, and I really do want to focus on what is practical and tangible to achieve. And fundamentally, I think the first thing we need to look at is stop subsidising the linear economy. We need to then set some circular economy policies that encompass a number of key actions, and some of those Richard touched on. But I think we need to think about remodelling the financial lending system. It's also very extractive, and a lot of our capital doesn't sit in the productive economy. It sits in large fixed assets. We need to start banning the importation of products that are built to break, that built-in obsolescence that fuels the linear economy. We need to invest in clean energy to decarbonise our industries and create higher value-added products into the global marketplace. That is certainly a value proposition for Europe. And we need to reshore manufacturing and advance our industry by looking at technologies like 3D printing. We need the polluter pays principle, as Richard rightly pointed out. That would change the game a lot. We also need to invest in education. I know that was the session prior to the one before we started talking. We need to actually invest in education from the schools to the boardrooms on the circular economy. We can absolutely, as a government, move beyond just investing in infrastructure as the only means to stimulate economic productivity. We need to look at domestic sourcing. Let's support local and Australian-led businesses. And lastly, we need to strengthen our emphasis and have requirements on transparency that are facilitated by the emerging technologies that allow traceability. We need honesty more than ever in our societies, our politics, and our supply chains. And that, if we take some of those steps, we will certainly get much closer away from a linear economy to a circular one.
Thanks, Ashleigh. Some really important points there, and even one that I can kind of apply in my household. I'm always telling my children about some of the toys that they are getting, but I have never used the phrase "built to break," which I think might have a stronger kind of impact in terms of my communication with my kids. So thank you for that. Jane, coming back to some of these suggestions and the roadmap, I mean, where do you think the priority kind of is in terms of the roadmap? And where you would kind of go first in terms of perhaps, as Ashleigh put it, some of the practical things, perhaps some of the low-hanging fruit, where are the areas that you would be focusing on? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. The challenge in all this is the complexity of players and the complexity of pieces to truly achieve a circular economy. And I think depending on our perspective, we will all see different priorities. Ashleigh has just outlined some fantastic list of ideas around that we actually do have to realise to achieve a circular economy. I think from where I'm sitting, I would really love to see better cohesion across different levels of government, and not just government, but a better collaboration between government, research and industry, because I think there's so many good things that are happening in small ways, but we don't have the cohesion. And I look at the sort of passion for so many people for moving to a circular economy and their inability to do it because of what's available for consumers and the blockages in the system. And I think it does take government and policy consistency between the many different players in government. So there's so many different policy domains. We need integration between economic, fiscal, environmental policy agendas, and we need it at federal, state, local government agendas. And I think that having that consistency is going to be really important to lining up the key initiatives that we do need to invest in. And clearly, cohesion across government will ensure a shared vision, but it's also going to ensure that there are consistent policies and measures, and ideally the adjustment of fees and incentives to collectively favour circular economy business models. And I think that regulation and standard setting so that consumers, organisations know what they're buying and the life cycle of products is actually really important, because I think people do have a willingness to invest in circular economy if they know how to. And I look at the labelling that's recently been brought in around imported food, and that that has actually been quite transformative in terms of people making decisions about what food they buy, whether they support local industry or whether they buy overseas imported vegetables. So I think simply providing that information across the different jurisdictions is going to be really important. But finally, I think there is a missing piece, which is the fundamental research, which of course you might expect me to say, but not just the research, but translating that research and commercialising it. I think there's some amazing ideas out in the research sector, but we're not necessarily making the right connections between them and industry to getting good ideas upscaled so that they can be adopted. and again, I think that's a very important role for government, but also partnerships between government and private sector to actually upscale from the test tube, if you like, to full-scale production. And that's not what we're very good in Australia. We're quite good at the great ideas, and then we tend to, sell them off overseas. So I'd really love to see a vibrant supply innovation chain to realising some of those breakthroughs.
Thanks, Jane. Some really important suggestions there, including cohesion across governments. Boy, we would like to see that in this and a number of areas at the moment. I think we have got some questions, including touching on some issues that have come up through the discussion so far. And I might come to you first on this one, Ashleigh. Richard mentioned the issue of plastics versus cardboard, paper. And what we've seen, and this question goes to, how do we stop creating new plastics and plastics becoming microplastics? How do we really break through on this issue of plastics?
It's a very sensitive topic, I think, for so many people. Plastics, it's very much a hot topic. I think plastic actually is a set of different polymers. Actually, they do brilliant jobs in keeping our products that are contained within them, without them losing value, those that are on our supermarket shelf. But the supply chain is not set up to allow for circularity. And even if we recycled and captured every bit of plastic, you still lose value in the recycling process. It can be quite resource intensive in its own right. So I think we fundamentally need to ask ourselves the question, what is suitable to actually use plastic for? And it certainly shouldn't be in these smaller packaged goods that are essentially used once and then discarded, because we know the economics at the other end just don't stack up in terms of trying to collect them in a clean stream, invest in the infrastructure to support that recovery. And even ultimately, as I just said, if we recycled everything, we're still actually ultimately at the end of the day going to end up with a zero-sum game. There'll be no plastic left. So it's a use case. Where is plastic most suited to be used? And let's start to redirect our efforts there and incentivising industry to stop using plastic so ubiquitously in so many single-use applications and start seeing it in longer-term applications, because it's a hard durable. It will outlive all of us. So why is it wrapping our biscuits up? And the answer is because it's cheap. And that goes to bigger questions around crude oil and our incentive on still mining and using fossil fuels.
Richard, I'm wondering if you want to weigh in on this one as well, because obviously, you were talking about some of the policy options that are out there, and obviously one of them is producers taking greater responsibility on these things. Do you have a view on what might be the breakthrough on plastics?
Yeah, there isn't a silver bullet for plastics is the first obvious point to make. And I would agree with what Ashleigh said, that the starting point is to look at where do we really need to use that material. I mean, it's absolutely clear that if we hadn't been using that material for the last 30 years, then there would have been huge emissions of carbon through the use of more metals and paper and glass. So that would have, raised sea temperatures and probably killed the coral reef by now. So I think the evidence that plastic is important is definitely there. The fact that people litter with it and it's ending up in the oceans and everywhere is not acceptable. So we have to revisit the entire topic. And I do think by putting the responsibility back to the manufacturer allows them to optimize the costs, because manufacturers and business are really good at optimizing their costs. So if you put the costs with them, they will make it better. And I actually, maybe controversially think that some single-use plastics do make sense overall environmentally if you recover the material, but that's a debate you can kind of have forever. The key to it is a bit of everything, a bit of reduction, a bit of banning, a bit more recycling, and really need to have people using more recycled content in the new product. But I would at the same time agree with what Ashleigh said about, can't recycle things forever. So we need other solutions too.
Thanks for that, Richard. Jane, we've got a question that I think you're probably pretty well equipped to answer, just around how you think about water in terms of circular economy, and certainly a topic that came up earlier today in our infrastructure session as well. A lot of people really focused on water. Where does that sit within and outside this, circular economy concept?
It's a really good question, actually. It's probably one we need to reflect on more often. But there are certainly parallels between circular economy and water. And I guess we've probably been thinking about how do we conserve and reuse water for a lot longer than we've been thinking about this supply of sort of readily made plastics. But the principles are basically the same. We only have a finite supply of the resource. There are many competing uses. And actually the market valuation of water that's happened in recent years in Australia has actually allowed us to put a price on the market value of supplying water, which has meant that water is now, where this is applied, it goes to the highest value use. And I think that sort of needs to be applied to circular economy too, because actually we don't pay for the full prices of the production of a lot of the material that we do use. There is an awful lot of sort of simple supply dynamics in water. I think circular economy is a lot more complex, but nonetheless, there's a really good analogue in how do we conserve water and how do we ensure that communities put water or other commodities to the highest value use. And we're still learning our way in water management. How do we actually have proper consultation, and how do we ensure that all users can have some say in how water's used? But I think we need to get to that point in circular economy too, where we actually have a sensible debate about what's the highest value use of our resources, and certainly recognising that they're not just finished when we stick them in a hole in the ground. They're still actually a resource that has internalised costs from the production of the resource, and that we're wasting those costs if we just put it in the ground. I think that sort of sense of recycling that we routinely do with water, that thinking has a lot of value when we apply it to circular economy. But it's probably a whole fascinating session of many hours looking at the analogues and the learnings that we could make from the two sort of streams of work.
Well, that might be an idea for a future CEDA discussion there, Jane. You've given us a good idea there. Another question that's come in on the portal, and I might come to everyone on this, but start with you, Ashleigh, and being pretty blunt about it, has said, who are the losers out of moving to a circular economy? If so, is this impacting the politics of a successful transition, and how do we deal with it? I might also ask on this one to everyone. There is obviously the potential here for some really good kind of communication, and people, as we talked about before, seeing the tangible kind of benefits and projects in this. And it might be worth, in the context of this question, also reflecting on kind of initiatives or things that we've seen both in Australia and overseas that have really helped to drive some of the behavioural change from some that might be a bit more hesitant than others to kind of jump on board with this. Ashleigh, what's your response? Because obviously, at the outset, I pointed out there's a lot of big economic benefits from this, as well as ecological and environmental longer term. How do you respond to that idea that there's losers in this?
There will be losers, but it really depends on what circular economy we create. And I think we're right at the precipice of actually starting to form a narrative about what type of economy do we want to have, and how are we going to utilise the principles of circularity to get us there. So, to draw it to a practical example, I think what most people see, and I guess the bigger global narrative, is we're going to see primary producers affected if they do not meaningfully participate in circularity at the point of production, in terms of decarbonising and embedding circularity into and how they perform, because we are starting to close loops, and we're going to need to actually, advance our relationship in supply chains to do that. But in some cases, we might see primary producers, and I'm not just talking about mining and metals companies, I'm also talking about, cotton growers. If we're going to, extend the use of products' life, design them for durability, disassembly, invest in technologies like a fibre separation technology to remake a cotton shirt, for example, there's going to be more of a shift in the economy to the downstream, and things staying in use for longer, coupled by these, product to service transitions. And a really good example that's happened in all of our lifetime is we used to have DVD stores and CD stores. They're gone. And that's because we've seen a shift from a physical material product to one that's now through streaming, and that's controlled by only a handful of companies in the world. So there is a risk in the circular economy that we're going to see the control of resources and stocks and flows in a handful of only several major entities. The question is that the circular economy we want? It will help address ecological, externalities. It still might assure some jobs, but probably not as many. But, it's really a big question for us all to consider. And as Jane pointed out, just in the water question, we really need to think about what's the highest value use, and really, how do we define value? Is it jobs? Is it the benefit to the environment? Is it economic productivity? And I will say today, the way we measure value is pretty limited. And it's very much focused just on the fiscal side of things. And I think there's just a bigger opportunity now to really focus about what type of economy we want and what role does the principles of circularity have to play, because yes, there are going to be losers. But if we can design with that in mind, then we can try to mitigate that risk and loss and enhance one part of the system to uplift another.
Thanks, Ashleigh. And you've raised some questions in my mind around, industry concentration and, potential kind of unintended consequences around competition in all of this, just based on those historical examples. Richard, what are you seeing in terms of, the projects and clients that you're working with in terms of this question about the people who may have, certainly in the short term, negative impacts as a result of this shift?
Yeah, I don't think there are losers. I think the losers will be the people that don't move towards a circular economy, the same as the losers will be, people that don't reduce their carbon impacts. This is the direction that the world has to take in order to preserve the environment. So there isn't an option to stay doing what we're doing. So clearly the losers are the people that don't move towards a circular economy, don't reduce their carbon emissions. I think first movers, where they can make it economically viable, will have an advantage because they will be less reliant on virgin materials, less reliant on imports, less reliant on having to reduce their carbon emissions, and it will be cheaper if they found that commercial model. It is a systemic change, and change is the thing that's the problem, because everybody has to move simultaneously. Local authorities, regulators, consumers, manufacturing businesses, recycling companies, they all have to move at the same time, and that's very complex to make happen. And then I think, there's the political challenge of it. When I moved to Australia 6 months ago, my 5-year-old daughter asked me what we were moving for, and I said, well, she never really asked me what I do before. I said, we're going to recycle water and we're going to, recycle plastics and things. And she said, oh, okay, does that mean that I have to drink the toilet water? And I said, no, it doesn't mean that. But actually, that's what people think as soon as you talk about recycling water. So the challenge is education and political, and there's all that change that needs to happen. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Richard. And I grew up in Toowoomba, so the kind of debate around recycled water, I have some serious wounds and some people who don't talk to me in that community anymore. So I won't go there. But Jane, just finishing with you, because we are getting close to time. What are you seeing here, particularly when you look at the from the perspective of the roadmap? Where do we factor this in terms of the steps that we take and how we plan some of these transitions?
Yeah, I think as Richard and Ashleigh have said, that this is, as with everything to do with the circular economy, it's really complex. But the losers are going to be those who will not or cannot see the opportunities in the transition. And I sort of the analogy is that the energy market transition that's underway at the moment, and so many of the energy companies who've traditionally been reliant on fossil fuels are transitioning to a portfolio that includes renewable energy because they can see the writing on the wall. And I think circular economy is a bit like this. The opportunities of the shifting to a circular economy, and in fact the societal focus on social license to operate, environmental responsibility, means that companies that don't jump on this agenda are going to be left behind. So I think the challenge is for those companies and those individuals who cannot, because of either their position in the economy or their financial ability to do it. This is where I think government really comes in, and then some of the pieces of the roadmap come into play. And one of those is education and unpacking the steps and understanding the costs and the opportunities of transitioning. So, and I think that widespread community and organisational education is really important. I think data is really important too, so that we can actually prove that it's not a lose-lose if you jump onto transitioning to circular economy. And I think that for government, sort of providing picking up the gap where there is market failure and providing incentives and rebates for disadvantaged individuals and organisations to make that transition. I do think that's a really important thing, part of making sure there aren't losers in this, because some organisations and individuals will be better equipped to make the transition. But it's taking the staged approach too, as I sort of outlined earlier. There's different phases in this, and I think although we need to move quickly, ideally, they're recognising that it will take time to bring the whole economy, and making sure there's support at the different phases of transition to the affected people is going to be really important. So I do think there's an important role for government, but also for businesses to sort of focus on the areas where the transition is not easy and there are losers.
Well, thank you for that, Jane, and thanks to the panel. I mean, fantastic discussion and various perspectives on this, right from the macro level down to the community level, which I think has been fantastic. So thank you, Richard, Ashleigh and Jane, for a fantastic conversation, and certainly plenty of audience participation and questions there, which is always a good sign. I think, three things I took out, the narrative, the fact that we need to have a clearer kind of bigger economic story about this and where it all fits in, and that also needs to be tangible to people in the community in terms of projects. Also, there's some things that we're going to have to stop doing, but there's also some things that we're going to have to start doing, and some of those things that we need to start doing are going to be challenging. There is going to be some opposition, but they're really important in terms of the responsibility that different players in the economy take for some of their products and the disposal and recycling of those, but also around, sorry to be an economist, but pricing externalities as well. And as Richard says, in some cases when people wear the costs, it turns out that they are exceptionally good at innovating and finding new ways to do things. So thank you very much to our panellists and also to the audience. Fantastic questions. Thank you for your participation today. We're now going to move straight to our day 2 wrap up, and Melinda Salento is joining me now.
Everyone, I'm just getting myself settled here, trying not to get too close to Jared. I jumped into the tail end of that conversation, and what a fantastic end to our State of the Nation conference. It's been a fabulous couple of days, starting on Wednesday night in Canberra, face-to-face online, and here we are. I'm getting directions to look at the right camera, sorry. And here we are already wrapping things up. It just seems like it's gone so quickly. Jared, I thought you and I might just have a quick conversation around some of the key insights over the last couple of days, draw things together. I think maybe a useful way to finish off is the way I started off, which is by talking about the 5 themes that we're focusing on in our work. And the 5 questions that we're sort of asking ourselves through both our research, but also through programming and events like this. Why don't we start with our first question, which is how can Australia develop and grow a more dynamic economy, and some of the insights that you think have popped out of the conversations over the last couple of days.
Yeah, so really interesting on this. I think actually the Treasurer set the stage quite well for this, in the fact that he was very clear to say that the economy will be different after COVID. Now, I know that a number of people have been talking about that. I'm not sure that we've been, certainly the government has been quite as explicit on that point. So it was interesting that he really zoned in on that. And then what we saw then in the rest of the conference was really discussions around, how you might take some of the things that we've seen during COVID and kind of extend them into the long-term lessons. And probably, a really good discussion, I think, at the end of yesterday with Mariana Mazzucato, where talking about a number of things, but around just the fact that you need quality private and public institutions to make, really big, innovative changes. And obviously, our the majority of our public and private institutions during COVID have served us well. We've got good foundations. Yes, we need to make some adjustments, but I think we're kind of working from a strong economic base and a reasonably strong institutional base. But we kind of need to take that next step in terms of the vision and what we want to happen.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it was interesting to hear the Treasurer talk about the transformation, if you like, post-COVID and how we've changed through COVID. Because in some ways, I think there's been so much focus on the V of recovery and so much of the narrative around, we've got back to where we were, before COVID. And that's fantastic and it is a fantastic recovery. But we're basically saying we've got back to where we were in 2019. And I think the big question on everyone's mind is what next? I think for my takeout, there are sort of two sort of bookends to the conversation, which is the right here, right now. There's absolutely no denying that there was a lot of conversation around closed borders and the impact that that's going to have, not just immediately, but also ongoing in terms of our trading relationships, for instance, and the future opportunities that we may miss out on because we're sort of stuck in a holding pattern. So I think the sort of closed borders vaccine piece is something that really came up right here, right now. But then some really big picture sort of conversations around how we transform our economy. As you said, sort of finishing with Mariana Mazzucato and a really, I think, big challenge to us about thinking differently. She started her remarks with the comment about the need to move away from ideology, which in some of my social media I said was interesting because the Treasurer talked about the complete absence of ideology when they were framing up the response to the crisis. So I guess there's a challenge there. If we can get rid of ideology when we absolutely must, why don't we get rid of it and explore new solutions? So that was really a bit of a tone for me on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can kind of connect that through to some of the conversation that we did have on dynamic economy, including with Sue McCluskey, who happened to be involved in some of those responses through the COVID Commission, and her point about the fact that there weren't solutions, and therefore that actually required them to focus a lot more on the problem first, and perhaps that is really important in terms of being a bit agnostic and not ideological about the solutions, because often when the solutions are there or are perceived to be there, it's very easy to jump to them.
Yeah, and Josh Frydenberg also spoke about what I thought was a different approach from the government, not just in terms of the crisis response, but in how they're approaching some of the decision making around the transition around climate and energy. So a lot in there. If you haven't had a look at some of the videos, they will be available online. Let's move into the next question that we've got on our agenda, which is how do we develop leading workplaces and workforces? I'll kick off if you like. I mean, I did the session on how we rethink the tertiary education system, and I think a really strong message there around the fact that we are going to have to rethink how we train people and how we think about skills rather than knowledge, how we build experience in the workplace and start to better reflect the capabilities and characteristics that you need as much as the sort of formal knowledge base. So that was sort of an interesting takeout for me. Anything you picked up from other sessions?
Look, I think there's a really interesting question at the moment about we're kind of creating this false dichotomy, I think, at the moment between closed borders and open borders and the impact on our labour market, and that closed borders are great for now, that this is driving skill shortages and will lift wages. But it's clear that there are a number of sectors that are really struggling. really struggling to get labour, and in some cases struggling to meet these pockets of considerable demand that we have as a result of that sort of V-shaped recovery. And certainly I think back to our CEDA work on skilled migration, and the fact that we've got to collaborate and integrate the two kind of systems around training and also migration. It's not one or the other. We need both, but we also need to be really strategic about how we use both of them to have the labour market that we need in the future.
So the next question we sort of grapple with is leveraging the benefits of technology. And I guess not surprisingly, I think that came out across a really wide range of conversations. I caught the tail end of the circular economy conversation. There's no doubt that there's a real element of that in terms of new ways of doing things. But of course, came out in the cybersecurity conversation, because that's really critical to what we do with technology. The opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, spoke to some initiatives that they've got in play around startup funding and things like that. So clearly on everyone's mind. And then, finally for me, in the conversation around defence capability, and I think one of the things we focused on in that conversation was really drawing out the experiences of other countries like the US, where defence R&D and innovation is really underpinned technology and innovation more broadly throughout the economy. Take it from you, Jared.
Yeah, I guess just the importance of policy settings in this space. I think we often think that this technology and innovation will happen in absence of big kind of strokes in terms of policy. But certainly through the infrastructure discussion, there was a lot of optimism about the fact that Australia has some great skills and capabilities in this area. We also have Infrastructure Australia, which we need to remind ourselves a lot of other countries don't have that kind of independent institution looking at infrastructure. And so we do need to harness those things. And Romilly Maju talked specifically about the fact that the states do have net zero targets. And so therefore, those net zero targets need to be embedded in infrastructure requirements and assessments to make sure that we're getting the infrastructure that lives up to that kind of longer term goal. And I think similarly with circular economy, as we've just heard, there is that capability there. We are seeing demonstration projects, and as Richard Kirkman said, the private sector, when facing some of these new costs, is absolutely ruthless in terms of innovation and changing the way that they do things. So if we can get those policy settings right to put those incentives on different players in the economy, we can actually see the change that we need.
So one of the things that we're also always very strongly focused on through our entire agenda at CEDA is how we connect the opportunities of economic growth and economic development more broadly. And we really capture that in thinking about how we can build vibrant communities. I'm going to get you to start on this one, Jared. I know you had a really interesting session around the economy more broadly, but with speakers like Sam Mostyn, who really very focused on this across a range of different agendas. So what was your takeout?
Look, I think, a continuing theme, I think, in this space, particularly around disadvantage and labour market programs, when Sam was talking about some of the programs that have been most successful for youth employment, it's place-based and it's about giving local communities and areas, the kind of framework and some of the, investment and funding, and letting them run with it. And that's absolutely something that we saw in our Disrupting Disadvantage work in 2019, something that we'll continue to focus on later this year. But that just seems to be a consistent finding over recent years, and certainly something that Sam brought out in the context of some of the work that the Foundation for Young Australians are doing and seeing on the ground. So, and clearly we haven't necessarily, because of the success of the broader labour market and the fact that we are sitting at 5.1% unemployment, we perhaps haven't necessarily focused on that quite as much, or the fact that long-term unemployment has spiked, which often happens after economic downturns. So clearly we're going to need some more innovative thinking in some of these really important program areas.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think there has, not surprisingly, been a lot of focus on how we make sure all of the economy survives, if you like, through the pandemic. Interestingly, through the pandemic, we've actually developed some pretty innovative responses to addressing some pretty wicked problems that we've had, for instance, around homelessness. And this came up in some of our conversations as well around, in the middle of a crisis, we found some good solutions for that. How do we make sure that we maintain the sort of progress that we were actually able to achieve, and some of the really interesting outcomes that we saw through these sort of crisis experiments, if I can put it that way. Mariana Mazzucato, of course, brings a perspective to this as well, around when you're looking for solutions, how you bring to the table and empower different stakeholders. And she spoke a lot about stakeholders and made very clear that that includes, key members of communities that different policies and programs influence, and how their voice is heard at the table. Finally, climate resilience and regaining our energy advantage. I put this to the Treasurer around the net zero emissions by 2050. Still, obviously, the government's not quite there in terms of signing up to that aspiration. I think, not surprisingly, the Treasurer emphasised that from their perspective, there's a lot of progress being made, but that the community isn't interested in hearing too much about those big commitments without understanding the nuts and bolts of the how, is probably the shorthanded way. But obviously the topic got picked up in a bunch of other conversations, not least of which is the one that you were just having.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that there are opportunities, obviously, to achieve carbon abatement in particular areas, but also to improve, standards of living and our enjoyment of amenity and other things longer term. So I think that was really important. The other place that it came up was in the sustainable infrastructure conversation, and very much about the fact that right now we've got this tension. We've obviously got a record infrastructure spend and a desire to get that out the door in terms of the economic stimulus, which may see people rush in terms of the procurement of some of those projects and not put in the same work in terms of thinking longer term about how you make those investments sustainable and resilient. And I thought the panel there gave some really good kind of suggestions, including I asked this question to the whole group around it seems that we are often successful when we don't wait for the big policy commitment, and certainly it seems that companies are getting on with this now. And I think the response from the panel was that the same in infrastructure, that states have the policy levers to make some of these changes, and certainly companies like Cardno working in communities and with clients are really making these things happen on the ground. So I think some reason to be positive there, despite the fact that this continues to be a very challenging political topic.
Yeah, I mean, a similar theme came up, of course, in our conversation on trade resilience, and the question around, as the rest of the world seems to move ahead in terms of decarbonisation, particularly some of our major trading partners like China, like Korea, like Japan, what does that mean for Australian exporters? And the response from BHP on that was more opportunity, quite frankly. So I think very similar sort of vein, that businesses getting on with this and seeing what where the world was heading and what the expectation of their customers and their investors is. So we'll watch that space, and that's obviously something we'll pick up on our agenda. Well, Jared, thanks for your involvement in the past couple of days. Thank you also to our more than 30 speakers who've participated over the past couple of days in Canberra, here on the live streams with us. It's been great. We really appreciate the time and energy that you commit to these types of events and sharing your knowledge and insights with us and our members. Thanks again to our major conference sponsors. You can see them behind us, but Commonwealth Bank, KPMG, and our dinner sponsor, CIRO, from the start of our forum. And day one sponsor, outer or .au domain administration, for those of you less familiar with the acronym. We really appreciate the support, and I think we've said that a number of times, but we keep saying it because we actually do mean it. Our speakers, sponsors and members have really helped us drive an incredible set of conversations over the past couple of days. We've had great engagement from ministers and from the Leader of the Opposition, the Treasurer. Always great to have them involved as well. Across the days, live stream, people on our stage, people in the room. We've had about 800 people involved in this year's State of the Nation Forum, a tremendous outcome for us. We take great heart from that. If you've got any feedback for us on things that you would like to see us cover more of, or feedback on how the last couple of days have gone, please drop the team an email. You can continue to engage, obviously through social media. You've got the app. All of the things that we've talked about and done over the past couple of days will continue to be available for you to access. If you've missed things, I hope you get online and take the advantage of being able to see them, even if you didn't get a chance at the time. Finally, the team here at CEDA, I think, has just done a fabulous job. Obviously, it's been a really challenging time with developments in Sydney having a pretty significant impact. I said earlier today, for those of us who are on the ground in Canberra, there were some goings-ons in Parliament as well, which saw a few late movements of speakers and all the rest. The team handled that really well, and I'd just like to say my thanks and appreciation to them. All of the work that we've talked about is going to be in our minds for the days, weeks and year ahead. Please continue to engage with us. Look out for the post-conference email and jump on the website to see what we've got coming up next. Thank you so much, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.